Welcome to Outside Views Politics 101. Today we're diving into the fascinating and often misunderstood world of populism. Specifically, we'll look at how populism works and explore the differences between left-wing and right-wing populism. Now, populism is a term that gets thrown around a lot in political discussions, often with a negative connotation, and I also talked about this on this channel already. But populism at its core, it's a political approach that seeks to represent the people against the elite. It's a movement that can cross the political spectrum with both left-wing and right-wing versions that share certain traits, but also differ in key ways. To begin, let's define what we mean by populism. In simple terms, populism is a political style that emphasizes the idea of a pure purple versus a corrupt elite. Populist leaders claim to represent the common people, presenting themselves as champions of the ordinary citizens who stand up against a system that has become too elitist, corrupt, or out of touch. One of the hallmarks of populism is its anti-establishment rhetoric. Politics often argue that the traditional parties, institutions, and media are rigged or biased against the will of the people. And this rhetoric appeals to people's frustrations and feelings of alienation, particularly when they believe that the system no longer serves their interests. Now, both left-wing and right-wing populism share this general opposition to the establishment, but they focus on different aspects of what the people need and who they see as the enemy. Let's start with left-wing populism. Left-wing populism typically focuses on economic inequality, class struggle, and issues of social justice. Left-wing populists position themselves as defenders of the working class and marginalized groups, arguing that the elites exploit these groups for their own gain. The elite in left-wing populism often includes big corporations, wealthy individuals, and institutions that maintain economic inequalities. For left-wing populists, the goal is usually to redistribute power and wealth from the elite to the people. And one of the key tools of left-wing populism is the emphasis on economic reforms. Left-wing populists advocate for policies like progressive taxation, universal health care, affordable education, and labor rights. They argue that these policies will create a fairer, more just society where wealth and opportunity are more equally distributed. This brand of populism often criticizes capitalist structures and neoliberal policies, viewing them as mechanisms that prioritize profit over people. Left-wing populism also tends to emphasize inclusivity and diversity, advocating for the rights of minorities, immigrants, and other underrepresented groups. Right-wing populism, on the other hand, usually takes a quite different approach. Right-wing populists focus more on issues related to national identities, sovereignty, and cultural unity. They position themselves as defenders of traditional values and often rally against what they perceive as threats to national identity and security. For right-wing populists, the elite includes not only politicians and the wealthy, but also intellectuals, liberal media, and progressive activists who are seen as promoting values that undermine traditional culture and national identity. Right-wing populism often emphasizes issues like border control, immigration restrictions, and national sovereignty. And these populists argue that the elite are out of touch with the common people's desire for cultural stability and security. One of the key tools of right-wing populism is its focus on nationalism and identity politics. Right-wing populists often argue that their country's culture, heritage, and way of life are under threat from globalization, immigration, or multiculturalism. This brand of populism appeals to people's senses of pride in their national identity, portraying themselves as defenders of the real people against forces that seek to change or dilute that identity. While left-wing populism typically calls for economic reform, right-wing populism often calls for cultural preservation and a return to traditional values. Now, one of the interesting things about populism is how it uses the people as a unifying concept, but in very different ways depending on the political orientation. Left-wing populists view the people as the working class, the economically oppressed and marginalized communities. They aim to build a coalition of these groups to fight against the elite's economic power. Right-wing populists, however, often define the people more narrowly as those who share a particular cultural, religious, or ethnic identity. Their version of the people may exclude immigrants, minorities, or those who do not adhere to traditional values. In this sense, right-wing populism can sometimes create divisions within society by defining who belongs and who doesn't. Populist rhetoric is another key aspect to consider. Both left and right-wing populists use emotional, direct language that resonates with the frustrations and desires of their audiences. They often use slogans, catchphrases, and vivid language that is easy to remember and spreads quickly. Populist leaders present themselves as plain-speaking, anti-establishment figures who reject the politics as usual approach. And this direct, unfiltered style allows populists to connect with people who feel that traditional politicians are too polished or out of touch with their everyday concerns. Another important factor is the use of media in populist movements. Populists often rely heavily on social media and alternative media channels to bypass traditional news outlets, which they accuse of bias or elitism. By using social media, populist leaders can communicate directly with their followers, spreading their message quickly and mobilizing support. And this strategy allows populists to build a direct, unmediated connection with their audience, which enhances their appeal as authentic representatives of the people. And one of the challenges of populism is that it often relies on simple solutions to complex problems. Populist leaders promise quick fixes, suggesting that issues like inequality, immigration, or cultural conflict can be solved by draining the swamp or by taking back control. And these promises resonate with people who are frustrated by bureaucracy and slow-moving policy changes, but they can also lead to disappointment when these solutions don't materialize. In some cases, populist leaders can stoke resentment and division, creating an us versus them mentality that can be quite polarizing. It's also worth noting that populism is not inherently democratic or anti-democratic. Populism can emerge within democratic systems, and it often does so as a reaction to perceived failures of democracy. And populists argue that democratic institutions are corrupted by elites and do not truly represent the will of the people. However, once in power, some populist leaders have taken steps to undermine democratic norms, such as restricting the media, eroding judicial independence, or concentrating power. So while populism can be a force for change, it can also in many cases pose risks to democratic systems if checks and balances are weakened. Historically, we've seen examples of both left and right-wing populism around the world. In Latin America, for instance, left-wing populism has been prominent with leaders like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia. These leaders focused on wealth redistribution, social welfare programs, and resistance to neoliberal economic policies. They rallied the working class and rural populations, promising to empower the people against foreign interests and wealthy elites. In Europe and North America, right-wing populism has been more visible, with leaders like Donald Trump in the United States and Marine Le Pen in France, for example. And these leaders focused on nationalism, immigration control, and traditional values, appealing to those who feel left behind by globalization and by cultural change. Populism, whether left or right, often thrives in times of crisis or social change. Economic hardship, political corruption, and cultural shifts can create fertile grounds for populist movements. When people feel that their lives are being disrupted or that they are losing control, populist messages that promise to restore power to the people become more appealing. Populists tap into these anxieties and present themselves as champions of ordinary citizens against a system that is seen as broken or corrupt. However, The impact of populism varies widely depending on its implementation and its underlying goals. Left-wing populism, with its focus on economic equality, often promotes policies that expand social welfare, labor rights, and income redistribution. Right-wing populism, with its focus on national identity and cultural preservation, often promotes policies aimed at strengthening borders, limiting immigration, and prioritizing the interests of native-born citizens. Both forms of populism challenge the status quo, but they do so in fundamentally different ways, aiming to reshape society according to their distinct visions of what the people need. In the end, populism is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that reflects the hopes and frustrations of people across the political spectrum. Whether left-wing or right-wing, populism has the power to mobilize, inspire, and reshape societies. But it also has the potential to polarize, divide, and even destabilize democratic institutions. As we look at the world today, it's clear that populism is here to stay, evolving in response to the changing political and social landscapes. But the consequences are in the future. Thank you for turning into Outside Views Politics 101, where we break down the complex ideas shaping our world. And remember, understanding populism means understanding the forces that drive people to seek change, whether through left or right-wing paths, and whether it will keep our democracies alive or destroy them. Until next time, and the next video is right here in the end screen.